First, let me acknowledge the vision and leadership of the Balipara Foundation and, of course, my very good friend Ranjit. I think the work that you're doing in terms of nature and how you have a convergence between nature and economics is fundamental when we approach the challenges that not only confront Bangladesh, but a lot of the countries in the world today because of the growing impacts of climate change. And let me preface my remarks by saying two things. First is that Bangladesh contributes least to the problem of global emissions. If you look at statistics, it's not even 0.5%, and yet we are the most impacted. So of course there are issues of climate justice, climate equity, but I think in Bangladesh we have over the years transition. There's been a change in mindset. We don't see ourselves not as victims, of course, which we are, but we see ourselves more as leaders when it comes to adaptation and building resilience. And when I talk about resilience, it's not just absorbing shocks, but absorbing them and then placing ourselves at an even higher level by bouncing back, so that when the next impact is with us, we are better equipped to embrace that impact. So that'd be the first point. The second point in your question, you referred to policies and plans. I think in Bangladesh, we have something even more fundamental and even more critically important, and that is the Constitution of Bangladesh. And I'm very happy and proud to have been part of a process whereby we have a provision in our Constitution now, which talks about protection and improvement of the environment. So it's not just protection, it's also improvement. Which is a completely different direction. So we are not happy with the status quo. We actually want to bring about a qualitative change. And the other is it refers specifically to safeguarding and protecting wetlands, forests, biodiversity, wildlife for current and future citizens of the country. That in itself is a huge sustainability issue. And we have this provision in our Constitution under a section where we refer to as fundamental principles of state policy. So what that actually is that whatever plans, whatever legislation, whatever policies, whatever allocation of resources through the budgetary process we have is going to look at it through the lens of protecting and improving the environment. I think that is huge. So this is in terms of how we run the state. So governments are actually obliged to take that into account. And this has been a huge help. Plans, you're talking about the Delta Plan, the Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan. And what is really interesting about all these is, we are moving from adaptation to resilience to prosperity. And that is a very unique change in mindsets. People look at adaptation and resilience and stop there. But then what we are saying is, how can we transform, having achieved that resilience, how can we transform that to prosperity? And how can that prosperity then benefit the people that we represent, in terms of bringing about a change in their lives and livelihoods? So I think that is a very important context to have when we talk about Bangladesh. And of course, we all know the geographical position of the country. We are in the Delta, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and the Meghna Delta, which is the third largest after the Amazon and the Congo. And we are at the lowest point of that delta. So it means any rise in sea level is going to impact us hugely, as it already is. And if you visualize a map of Bangladesh, you've got the Bay of Bengal to the south, and then you've got the Himalayas to the north. So we are like sandwiched in between. And on the one hand, we have rising sea levels, which is going to displace 40 million people, just a 1 meter rise in sea level. That is more than the population of many countries. And remember, Bangladesh is one of the most densely populated countries in the world. So losing land area and then people being displaced, and these are probably the most marginalized, the most vulnerable. They don't have access to resources. And then losing your land where you could have grown food, so your food security is impacted. And then you have the glacial melt to your north, which means that we have flooding in the short term, because the water from the melted glaciers flow through the major rivers into the Bay of Bengal. So you have flooding in the short term, and in the long term, or even perhaps now medium term, because of the rate of global warming, we are talking about freshwater scarcity. So water stress is another problem that we have in Bangladesh in the medium to long term. And as we all know, the Himalayas are the water towers for South Asia. So you have close to 800 million people who are actually relying on the glaciers in the Himalayas for the fresh water. And as we all know, if you look at what the science is telling us, most of the glaciers are going to be gone by the year 2030 if current temperature rises continue. And we know now that based on current commitments of various countries, we are looking at a temperature rise which is close to 2.8 degrees Celsius. And we know that out of the Paris Agreement, we talked about a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, and we are already at 1.1. So what we have to take careful note of is the devastation, the pain, the loss, the destruction that we see today is based on just a temperature increase of 1.1. We are nowhere near 1.5. So 1.5 is not even a safe or a comfort zone. Think of the destruction and the impact if the temperature rises to 1.15, not even 1.2. So, these are realities that we have to take into account, which is why now the discourse has moved. If you look at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, it started off with a focus on mitigation. So the first 10 years, we were all focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Then the world realized that not enough was being done and people are suffering. So there also has to be a focus on adaptation. So the first 10 years mitigation, the next 10 years adaptation. And now in the third 10 years, 30 years on, we are looking at a situation where both mitigation and adaptation are not enough. We have not done enough in those areas. And now we are talking about loss and damage. So this has now become the third pillar. And Bangladesh, of course, has been advocating very strongly for it. When I was in Sharm el-Sheikh for COP27, I was the ministerial lead for the LDC ministers and closely involved in the discussions on loss and damage. And what we have had is at least that acknowledge that this is a new reality and action has to be taken. Of course, we are still some time away and processes away in terms of mobilizing the funding, identifying the sources of that funding, how the funding will be distributed. But at least we have made an important step. The concern, however, is that, at the end of the day, we all know that mitigation is the best form of adaptation. So if we continue to fail to rein in temperatures, and if you're looking at 2.8 as a global average, which means that for some countries who are near the tropic or the equator, you're looking at 3.3, 3.4 degrees. So at the end of the day, loss and damage becomes academic because everything will be loss and damage. We will not be talking about adaptation. And this is all the more reason why we should also look at nature-based solutions. One of the things that Bangladesh is now doing, and I'm very glad that we are doing it, is we are trying to institutionalize environmental statistics. We are trying to put a value on nature. I don't want to commercialize it, but I think what is important to realize is if you're not able to measure an asset, you're never going to be able to value it. So if I give you an example of Bangladesh, we have the Sundarbans, which is the largest mangrove forest that we have in the world. And we share that in part with India as well. 60% of the Sundarbans are in Bangladesh and 40% in India. How during every major tropical cyclone, the Sundarbans have acted as a shield to protect coastal communities. So how do you put a value to that? How do you put a value to the carbon sink that is already in the Sundarbans? How do you value ecosystems? So, I think trying to establish a base which captures the value of the natural capital that we have is very, very important. And then we try to, make sure that natural resources is not depleted, rather that we are able to increase it. And our idea is that we will also try and reflect it in our GDP. Because as I've said, unless we are able to capture and measure the worth of the services that nature is providing, we are never going to be able to value it or to protect it. So I think that is also an important step that Bangladesh is taking. And how you bring this convergence between nature and economics, how do you align these two principles so that at the end of the day, it's a win-win situation for everyone. And of course, the Eastern Himalayas are a critical region in that regard, in terms of how it weaves together, not just the major economies of India and China, but also that of countries like Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal. So I think the work that the Balipara Foundation is doing and this event that we are having in Dhaka, Bangladesh, is of course extremely timely. The other very important dimension is that if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we are about halfway through. And if you look at Asia Pacific, we are behind on each and every goal. And in some cases, as with the climate goal, there is actually regression. So 2030 is certainly not going to see us achieve the SDGs. If it is going to be business as usual, we are looking at 2065 or 68 perhaps. So there's a lot of work to be done. And all avenues, all potential areas that we can tap into are going to be extremely critical. And in Bangladesh, we see climate change as an existential crisis. We also talk about a planetary emergency where you have the climate impact, you have the increasing frequency and impact of disasters, you have water stress, which I've talked about, you have the loss in biodiversity, you also have challenges with food security. And of course, the other important point is, we are not living within planetary boundaries. So every year there is planetary overshoot. So how do we harmonize, if you like, the challenges that we have and find a common response for the common security and common good of the people in the region.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. Have a lovely day. Bye.
And you. Bye.